welcome everybody. I think we've got a very special afternoon with an exceptional panel of speakers on a fascinating topic. Just to say that some of our speakers are running late, so please forgive us or be a little bit patient with us. So we're going to change the order, given that some of the people haven't arrived yet. But nonetheless, this book launch, we're going to use it also as an opportunity to launch a new program at the NSI, which I'm very excited to announce. An opportunity to announce NSI's new research program on the histories of government, which is intended to contribute to historiographical and policy discussions in South Africa and more widely in the New South, by exploring the trajectories of state building through histories of the institutions that constitute the public domain, from national departments to regulatory agencies, tax authorities, and so on. In this regard, we've got some fascinating new pieces coming out shortly. An overview history of the National Treasury based on the archive of the National Treasury, which has been made available to us. Which will hopefully be available for general view in the next couple of weeks. We have an extraordinary new piece of work on important new urban dynamics, what the authors are calling ex-urbanization, essentially focusing on middle-class South Africans moving within the space of the city into land that is essentially traditional land, and the type and how that speaks to emerging and new forms of governance in the cities. We also have, I'm very pleased to announce, coming out soon is a new study of the National Prosecuting Authority. So the idea behind the program then is to do more, as I said, historical and more academically minded research on the state. Turning to this particular book launch, so Africa has been home to a wide variety of political systems, from large multi-ethnic empires to small culturally unified communities. Across the continent, many societies developed advanced forms of participatory governance, consensus building, and conflict resolution. These homegrown systems were often rooted in local worldviews and spiritual beliefs, which helped justify leadership and guide everyday political practice. Beyond Mimicry, which is the book which we are launching today, there is a growing interest in Africa and across the African diaspora in revisiting these indigenous political ideas and possible responses to today's global crisis of governance. In this context, the think tank Afro Perspectives, from which our speakers are all drawn, a global African initiative, has published an important new volume, Beyond Mimicry, The Potential of African Endogenous Governance Systems. The book brings together scholars from Africa and the diaspora who, through fieldwork and critical reflection, explore key features and principles of African governance traditions. From our point of view, from the NSI, this topic is of great importance as we grapple with the challenges of governance both in South Africa and across the African continent, trying to develop a practice and a public policy theory which pays serious attention to local situations and to local histories. In this regard, trying to unsettle or at least engage critically a body of thinking about government and the state, which is largely drawn from Western European and American experience, proliferated through institutions like the World Bank and the United Nations, which I think does not pay adequate attention to our local histories and local circumstances, meaning that sometimes in the words of Woolwood and others, there's a phenomenon of isomorphic mimicry, a tendency to reproduce phenomena and institutions because they worked elsewhere in the West, without paying sufficient attention to local circumstances and local institutions. But it's also an opportunity to experiment more seriously in the African context with practices which are endogenous to local communities and local circumstances. So this is very much the spirit and the intention of this seminar. Our other speakers have not joined us yet, so we're going to change the order slightly. I'm going to ask Lisa Aubrey to go first. Lisa is is a distinguished scholar, African political scientist. She's based at Arizona State University, an Africanist scholar whose work spans Pan-African studies, gender, migration, and African economic and political development. Has been involved in UNESCO-sponsored efforts to expand the pedagogical use of the general history of Africa, and many of our other speakers today have been involved very much in the production of the general history of Africa, to connect African historical narratives to contemporary social justice issues. She's also noted for her fieldwork on African diaspora returnees in Cameroon, contributions to gender and development studies, and public-facing scholarship on Africa diaspora relationships. Her last two books, In Search of Binbie, which is 2018, and Binbie Dévoilé in 2020, are based on her work in one of the largest sites of transatlantic slavery. And on that basis, I'm going to ask her to go first, but we're also joined by Professor Benon Basheka, who is a leading Ugandan scholar of public administration, a field of which many of you will know me from my work is largely in that field, governance and leadership. Formerly Vice Chancellor of the Uganda Technology and Management University and current professor at Kabale University. Basheka is renowned for his work on African governance systems, public sector reforms, monitoring and evaluation, and capacity development. Professor Basheka, all topics which are very, very much topical to my work and especially topical in South Africa. Professor Augustin Ferdinand Charles Oll is a distinguished Cameroonian archaeologist and anthropologist whose research focuses on early African civilizations, metallurgy, political formations, and cultural heritage. A former professor at the University of Michigan and the University of Paris-Nanterre, Holl has contributed extensively to the UNESCO General History of Africa series, serving as an editor and specialist on African proto-history and deep historical processes. His work has helped anchor the GHA's commitment to presenting Africa's ancient past as foundational to global history. Holl is widely recognized for advancing African-centered archaeological method and for training a new generation of African scholars. Last but certainly not least, because it's Dr. Ali Musa Iyer that is, and very grateful for the introduction, who's really helped together with a colleague of mine at the NSI, Yelena Videyevich, putting today's event together. Dr. Ali Musa Iyer is a Djiboutian scholar, writer, and former UNESCO official, known for his leadership in cultural diplomacy, memory studies, and anti-racism initiatives. As director of UNESCO's Division of Cultural Policies and Intercultural Dialogue, he played a pivotal role in overseeing and revitalizing the UNESCO General History of Africa project, including the preparation of its new volumes dedicated to contemporary African issues. Dr. Musa Iyer has been instrumental in promoting African intellectual autonomy, the decolonization of knowledge, and the global visibility of African histories. His work bridges scholarship, advocacy, and institutional reform. We'll ask Lisa Aubrey to go first, and then we'll go back to the program as it was originally intended, with Professor Augustin Oll first, and then Dr. Ali Musa Iyer. Just to say, it's a great honor and a great privilege to be able to host all of you in a virtual NSI event. The UNESCO General History of Africa, of course, is an absolutely key reference book for most African scholars. I know it's one of the key texts which I use frequently. So again, it's a great honor, great pleasure to meet all of you, even if it is virtually. And I look forward to the discussion. Lisa Aubrey, would you like to go first for 10 minutes or so?
Well, good afternoon, good morning. I'm in Louisiana. I'm so honored to be here today. I'd like to share my thoughts on this incredible book that we are launching today, Beyond Mimicry. I'd like to go to the second slide. Okay. Pan-Africanist Dwayne Wang Omawole asserts, and I'm quoting here, after slavery was abolished in Guyana, South America, Africans purchased land and established what they call Victoria Village with an independent system of government that was developed independently of the British colonial system. And he continues, coming out of slavery, our ancestors sought to develop their own systems rather than imitate their colonial masters. And he asserts we should do the same. This government was created by men named Kofi, Akara, Akabra. My point is, the formerly enslaved they went beyond mimicry of colonial government. And the question is, from where did they unearth their knowledge of governance and statecraft? And what we have is a photo of a monument that sits in Georgetown, Guyana, that is a commemoration of their desire to be free and autonomous. Likewise, I'd like to show another example. What we know is from the 1500s, and this is again in the Americas, enslaved Africans who were able to escape bondage, they became statecrafters and laid the foundations for governance. In the Maroon alliances that they created with the Native American communities, the original people of the land, we see that scholars make note of this happening in places in the US, in the state that I'm from, Louisiana, and also in Brazil, where African women also ruled. And what we have on the screen is a depiction of a woman that is named Filipa Maria Arana, and she is a case in point. And this is Brazil in the 1700s. This woman was captured as a child in present-day Guinea, and she was enslaved on a sugar plantation, and she grew to lead, and I have it here, a republic that had voting rights, that had democratic voting in place. This was in the Quilombo that is called Mola. That is also known, and I quote here, to have had a high degree of political, social, and military organization. And this may be a surprise to some of us. The question, again, is, from where did these enslaved Africans who escaped slavery learn statecraft? Where did they, not only men, but also women, learn how to govern? And could they have learned this from the endogenous systems that EA and Hall present to us today in Beyond Mimicry? And my answer is yes. I think that's where they learn statecraft. These are some critical questions that we have to ask ourselves today, especially as Africa continues to face governance challenges in 2025 in places like Cameroon and Tanzania that we have seen in the last month. The so-called third wave of democratization, and I say that, and I would like to point out, this is Western style democratization that we're talking about, not African style. This so-called third wave, we have seen has failed on many measures, and I won't go into that. There's a lot of literature, and maybe we can discuss this. But we see in 2025, in many places in Africa, and I quote Claude Ake here, we are still voting without choosing. But I think in 2025, we have to go beyond that analysis. The fact is that because of these waves of democratization, we are voting, yet what we are seeing is that we are voting and dying. Is beyond not choosing. We're voting and dying. And at the same time, as well, we are not voting and still dying. And that is a major crisis. So what does the post-colonial state really have to offer us? And that's a question that we must indeed interrogate. The book by E.A. and Hull, I think, raises these questions for us. In a diversity of case studies, 8 of them, what E.A. and Hull show us is that 1, Africa's endogenous governance systems are realities. They existed, and some continue to exist. They're not myths. It's not folklore. They existed. They are realities. What E.A. and Hull also show us is that African endogenous governance systems, they have legitimacies, they are legitimate with the people, and they have been validated across time and across space. And that's why I showed the examples that I did in both Africa and the African diaspora. In fact, the enslaved brought their knowledge, their skills, their determination to be free with them and governed accordingly. We see that with Kofi, we see that with Ankara in Guyana, we see that with Philippa and the woman that succeeded her in the Quilombo Malo. In some, and there's much more to talk about, but I'd like to say that Beyond Mimicry, which is the book that I encourage all of us to read, to teach, to share with others, it brings us to a renewal. And that is resuming the endogenous governance systems that were displaced, broken, or destroyed by colonialism. Beyond Mimicry also brings us a resurrection, a restoring of the endogenous governance systems that modernization theorists labeled as backwards. And we know that they were wrong and that they tried to hoodwink us. And I hope that we talk about this in the conversation. And Beyond Mimicry is also a reconnection. That is putting back together endogenous systems that worked in the past, not just for the historical record, but for the contemplation of what might be again. Beyond Mimicry is a call to action. It's a call to action of what needs to be. And that is, in Africa and the African diaspora, governance systems that respect and that are in sync with the people's way of being. Otherwise, no wave of democratization, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, on and on. There's no wave that will work if our systems are not in sync with the people and respect the people. So I encourage everybody, get your copy of Beyond Mimicry. I'm going to teach it in my classes, and I hope that you will as well. And I'd like to thank E.A. and Hull and their contributors for their incredible work. Thank you.
And Lisa, thank you very much for those opening remarks. I think the question that you posed is central to some of the work that I'm doing, and I around where did Africans, pre-colonial Africans, get their ideas of government? And of course, it's from the experience of government as an obvious one. But it's an especially important historical question, given the fact that so many of contemporary conceptions of government, ones which I am quite partial to be honest, but nonetheless, I think one has to recognize their historiography, or their history rather, are Chinese in origin, from the effects of the Jesuit translations of Confucian texts in the 17th century, finding them their ways to Western Europe, especially Germany and France, where they become hugely influential, shaping French and German philosophy in the 18th century, but also aesthetics, but also, very importantly, the study of government. So the whole German field of the study of government is strongly informed by these Confucian ideas, and at the heart of them is a separation, or the distinction between the public, within the public, of the political and the administrative, which is fundamental to Confucian ideas, and what increasingly and going as far as to influencing the Pendleton Act of 1883, which is fundamentally reforms the U.S. administration 1883, also heavily drawn from these Chinese conceptions of government. The same with the Trevelyan Northcote report in the UK in the 19th century, which explicitly references Confucian ideas of this distinction between the administrative and the political. So one has to take cognizance of the historiography of the ideas of government which we are dealing with, and especially which are disseminated and proliferated through institutions like the World Bank and development agencies like the UN, etc., and realize that the question you're asking, is there an alternative or a different historiography around the questions of governance and government on the African continent, which we need to reconstruct or think about? And I think it's a hugely important question. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Dr. E, and I think, of course, we'll open up for questions. Dr. E, I hope that you're still with us, because can we move on to you?
Yeah,
I've introduced you.
I'm going to I was supposed to begin the presentation, the rationale of this book, since Lisa Aubrey has already mentioned the book and really make the introduction of some of its aspect. So I'm going to present. So just to say that it's a great honor for me to be here with you and present the book published in last December. I would like to thank the New South Institute for hosting this book launch and panel discussion, and special thanks to Yelena and to Ivory Chipkin. This is the third event that we organized to promote this book that was published by the famous German publisher, De Gruyter. And I'm pleased here to inform the audience that we have negotiated with the publisher to make the electronic version of the book free access, the PDF and the ebook. So the cover you have already seen. So this book examines the paradox of Africa, a continent considered as the cradle of humankind and the birthplace of the first human civilization, and a continent that became the dumping ground for all kinds of ready-made thought and models developed under other skies and for other society. How did Africa become the continent where everything is now imported, including ideologies, socio-political organizations, and cultural behaviors? Independent, even when it was worn with armed struggle, was not a moment of divorce with the colonial system. Most of the new nation, born within artificial border, adopted without any question the model of nation state and the discourses on development, justice, and democracy inherited from colonization. The African rulers rushed to copy and paste political institutions, justice systems, imitating to the point of ridicule the details of Western protocol, rituals, and ceremonies for power representation. As a result, decade after independence, African leaders has nothing to offer their people other than a limited choice between a system of thought and ideology that was born elsewhere. Even the African continental organization like the African Union, the SADC, and others that were put in place after independence reproduce the political, organizational, and institutional mimicry by following the model of the United States, of European Union, World Bank, and thus adopting Eurocentric vision of consensus building, human rights, democracy, international relations, and cooperation. These observations raise the crucial question of the nature of sovereignty that African independent nations has been able to exercise in the choice of their political and socio-economical system. These choiceless democracy and choiceless states, to use the concept introduced by the African economist Tandika Nkandewere, have brought African people to the current critical situation. So today, ladies and gentlemen, I think that there is a glimmer of hope on the horizon. Humanity has reached a new turning point in its evolution. The globalized models, development models, is no longer sustainable and is putting humanity and the planet at risk. The dominant system has entered in a kind of runway, a vicious circle that no one can really control anymore, not even those who impose it to the world. And most of the philosophical, ethical, and socio-political presuppositions on which the dominant system is based are all in crisis, raising serious doubt about their relevance, their universalities, their sustainability, and of course, their benefit for all people. And I think the genocide in Gaza has achieved the last credibility of Western so-called system of value. So new voices from Africa, Asia, South America are racing to offer counter-narratives that strive to emancipate from the coloniality of knowledge, which legitimize the coloniality of power and perpetuate the coloniality of beings in most of our nations. This crisis of the dominant system offer thinkers, scholars, and professionals from global Africa, and when I say global Africa, it's Africa and it is diaspora, an unexpected opportunity to speak from their position, from their historical experience, and finally share their vision of governance, justice, human rights, and development. So despite the persistence of Afro-pessimism, which continue to discredit Africans' ability to trace its own path, the dream of Pan-Africanism is rising from the ashes and raising new hope among the younger generation of global Africa. They are forging a new Pan-Africanist discourses around the search for alternatives responses to critical issues such as the new scramble for Africa's land and resource, the reparation of the crime of slavery and colonization and apartheid, the restitution of looted land and cultural properties. This new generation are pushing their leaders to emancipate themselves from the bounds of subordination and dependence. And we see all what's happening around the world, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, and now in Tanzania, in Madagascar, and we hope in other countries, are showing that this new generation have decided to take really the future in their hand. And this comes at a time of geopolitical reconfiguration with the realignment of the countries of the global South, the emergence of the BRICS, and the aspiration for a true multipolar world. So this Pan-Africanist discourses is based on serious research undertaken by global African thinkers, scholars, and creators who are rediscovering that Africa is home to an incredible diversity of socio-political organization ranging from the multi-ethnic empire structure to a small homogeneous community formation. It is the continent per excellence where sophisticated method of consensus building, conflict management, and reconciliation mechanism has been elaborated. So the notion of the nation-state model inherited from Europe as the product of a tormented history marked by terrible war, including the so-called World War, is totally, seriously questioned. By revitalizing their cosmogonies, ontologies, political philosophies, and spirituality, African people could add their voice to that of other people of the world to prove that there is another horizon for humanity than capitalism, materialism, and unlimited consumerism that are ravaging the planet. So, for instance, the federal form of organization invited in ancient Egypt and in West Africa during the period of the Great African Empire are examples of indigenous solution to the question of unity in diversity, decentralization of power, and preservation of social cohesion. So it is to contribute to this effort of reconceptualization that we created our think tank, Afrospective, a global African initiative to rethink African presence in the world and African contribution to humanity. So we have undertaken several activities to explore African knowledge, system, and practices. And this book that we are presenting today is the first of a series. And the choice for us to open the series with the issue of governance and justice is justified by the current democratic crisis in Africa as a result not only of the failure of important model, but I think, and we have to recognize the failure of our own leadership. So this issue of governance is at the heart today of the debate of African Renaissance and the AU's Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. So ladies and gentlemen, allow me now to recall that behind any model of governance, there are underlying metaphysical, philosophical, and spiritual interpretation that frame what we call the political ontology of a nation and inform about the collective response given to the fundamental question concerning power and justice in society. So governance is only a part of a larger system of interpretation, interaction, processes, which define the dynamic relationship between human and living and non-living beings. So in this book, and more generally in our work within Afrospective, we deliberately decided to use the adjective endogenous instead of indigenous or traditional to designate the experiences, knowledge, and practices developed in Africa in different periods of time. This semantic choice is part of the effort to deconstruct and decolonize the biased terminologies inherited from the colonial categorization that continue to be used on Africa. So the notion of indigeneity emphasizes the fact that the knowledge, know-how, and practices developed from within Africa's society have their own internal dynamic of evolution and should not be evaluated by using the paradigms of Western modernity. This concept of indigeneity obliged us also to revisit the very definition of the notion of tradition and modernity. So the main goal of this book is to revisit the rich philosophy and praxis about governance that were developed in Africa and in the African diaspora to regulate social relationship, power exercise, resource sharing, and interaction with other living and non-living entity. So the book includes contribution from scholars who undertook field research on African indigenous vision and practice of governance, and develop critical analysis on the main characteristic of this political heritage. So the book is divided in 2 parts and contain 10 chapters, which together analyzes various forms of community decision-making, consensus building, conflict resolution, and social justice, deeply rooted in African ontological belief, philosophical value, and spiritual practices. So, for instance, the research includes range from the early human social organization dating millennia, the Mad cosmogony of ancient Egypt, the Mandem Charter of the Mandang, the Hair of the Somalis, the Gada of the Oromos, the Ubuntu philosophy of the Bantu people, the Quilombos, and other political reimagination of Maroons in Brazil and Suriname. So, and now I would like to give the floor and to let my colleague, and co-editor of the book, Professor Augustin Hall, to present you the different section and chapter of the book. So I thank you for your attention.
Dr. Ye, thank you so much for that. I think we're having some difficulties with Professor Hall joining us. So from what I understand, he's not with us, unless perhaps he is, and I haven't noticed. And I saw that Professor Basheka had joined us, but I can't see him now, unless again
he joined us.
He is here, but Professor Basheka is with us. So Professor Basheka,
yes,
would
I
you?
Joined.
Thank you. That's great, and your timing is excellent. I had introduced you, but let me introduce you again. Professor Basheka is a Ugandan scholar of public administration, governance and leadership, formerly a vice chancellor of the Uganda Technology and Management University, and current professor at Kabale University, renowned for his work on African governance systems, public sector reforms, monitoring and evaluation, and capacity development. He's been a key contributor to the African Union and the United Nations and national initiatives on improving governance performance across the continent. Basheka's scholarship stresses the need to ground governance theories in African historical experiences, and he supported efforts, including those linked to the UNESCO initiative, to integrate African-centered governance knowledge into academic and policy frameworks. Professor Basheka, it's a great honor to welcome you and to give you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for the great introduction and for this session. I need to maybe know how long I have, the time I have.
Oh, it's as long as you want, 10 to 12 minutes.
Yeah, I think I should be done. So briefly, when I was requested by Dr. Moussa to make a presentation, I thought I would focus it on this theme, where my core message is whether we can revisit our past. Because when we are teaching public administration, normally, we tend to concentrate on the theories and the paradigms of public administration and governance from the Western perspective and forget the African context. So in my brief presentation, I'll give an introduction, then I'll briefly touch on the historical foundations of what we call the African governance, and make a comparison between the traditional justice systems with the contemporary systems of administration of justice. And then briefly, I will present some 2 case studies and I outline the challenges and opportunities, and I conclude within the time. So my major message is that as scholars of public administration and governance, we need to reassert the relevance of indigenous systems of governance and administration of justice. The systems referred to here are those which existed before what one would call the colonial period. There are two voices, two schools of thought. Some people believe that before the colonialists came, Africans were just a bunch of primitive communities without any form of administration, without any form of governance. But another view believes that that is not a correct position, that Africans, before the colonialists came, had their own systems of managing the affairs of the society, what we call the public affairs. And this understanding has to be taken within the context of the evolving economic, political, and social changes which have happened. And this system we are talking about was based on consensus, and the community was heavily involved in decision making. This system, the indigenous system of governance and administration, heavily relied on the role of elders, as we shall see. It also believed in a decentralized governance and social cohesion, and harmony was more paramount in that kind of system than anything else. There was no issue of who is right or who is wrong, as long as harmony was emphasized. When you compare it with the contemporary systems of governance and administration of justice, you would find, for example, in terms of foundational authority, the African endogenous systems of governance and justice based their authority on ancestors, the community consensus, and elders, unlike in the modern times where the constitutions or the elections or the statutory provisions dominate. Decision-making style was based on consensus and harmony, and like in the modern times, where majority rule or an adversarial system is emphasized, and the orientation of justice in our system we are referring to was restorative in nature and aimed primarily at reconciliation, unlike in the modern times where emphasis is on redistribution and punishment. And whenever conflict arose, then the mediation by elders or the chiefs took a center stage, unlike in the modern times where the courts or judges and legal representatives take a center stage. Although I need to emphasize as well that in the modern judicial processes, alternative dispute resolutions, ADR, are currently being emphasized, which mirrors what used to be there in the past. The social accountability was based on moral obligations, unlike the modern times, which is based on legal sanctions and oversight bodies. And the community was highly involved, unlike today where there is a formal civic engagement. And all these features, I have shared my presentation with Dr. Mausa, he can share with you. Now, within the indigenous systems of administration of justice, they had structures. And among the key structures, the first primary structure was the family, because it was considered as the first level of dispute resolution. Each individual belonged to a family, and the heads of households and senior relatives would mediate in a conflict whenever it arose. And their jurisdiction normally relied on common crimes, for example, conflicts in marriages, conflicts during inheritance, and also domestic issues. But as the problems, the grievances became complex, then these would be handled by the clan tribunals, which were composed of respected clan elders, and their authority was rooted mainly in lineage traditions. But as societies expanded, you'd also find the chiefs and traditional leaders making a major input in resolving the disputes, and the Council of Elders performed the highest role, the highest community-based authority, where they would offer impartial judgments based normally on wisdom, their wisdom, as well as the customs of a particular society where such a grievance would arise. But they could also handle serious crimes, what we would call in the modern times criminal offenses. For example, homicide. If someone killed another, this case was complex and it could be handled by the Council of Elders, given their wisdom and custom. And then they would also resolve serious land disputes, as well as marital dissolution. If this is the equivalent of what we know today as divorce. Divorce matters would be handled by this highest authority. But also whenever there were conflicts between clans, then this Council of Elders had that primary responsibility. Alongside, there were spiritual authorities who were diviners, they were healers, and they were considered as customs of spiritual norms. And normally these would be relied upon whenever there were cases that required cleansing. As I will show shortly, one of the remedies which was common during this period was cleansing. And sometimes in order to ensure transparency, taking oath and detecting wrongs would be the preserve of this organ. You would also be surprised that there was a well-documented system of how grievances would be addressed. First of all, somebody who was aggrieved would raise a complaint, and once a complaint was raised, then the individual would be summoned, and these disputes would be reported to elders, and the parties would be summoned through the messages, through the messengers, or sometimes they would use any medium of communication that would call on the parties which were in dispute, but also the community. Then they would go through a process of public hearing. We have it in the modern judicial system, that once you have a case and your advocates report it in court, if it is a civil matter or if it is a criminal offense, then there is a hearing where the community would gather, they would discuss openly, and the elders would moderate that discussion. And they would give an opportunity to the parties that were in dispute to tell their side of the story. Because the principle of natural justice, that you cannot be, a case cannot be decided unless you hear both sides. So this was prevalent. Parties would be allowed to narrate their events. Even witnesses would be called to contribute, and the elders would put across questions like it is done in the modern judicial system. And evidence normally was in an oral nature, and then they used to rely on the knowledge of the community, and they would take oath, an oath as we do it in the modern times. When you assume a public office, sometimes you are required to take an oath of allegiance or an oath of office to ensure that you keep the rules and the constitutional provisions depending on the level in which you are. So these individuals also had oath, and eventually some cases would be sent for mediation and for consensus. And where there was no consensus and mediation, then they would go through judgment. They would pass a resolution, usually based on the evidence that had been presented, based on the witnesses, and based on the wisdom of the elders. And because the emphasis was normally on harmony of the society, the outcome would result into rituals and cleansing, where these would be used in serious crimes like homicide, in adultery, in land discretion, rituals, and the purpose was to restore the balance and to reintegrate the offenders in society. And finally, in their system, they had the mechanisms of enforcement. The society generally played a key role, the relatives, and of course the elders would also play a dominant role. So these are cross-cutting features of the systems. It was holistic, it was community-centered. They used it to rely on accountability and so on. Now, whenever a party was found in the wrong, there are some common remedies that appear to cut across African societies. For example, there would be compensation, and you could compensate either livestock or material compensation, or you would make a public apology. Sometimes the family members in our respective societies, you'd find the public or the family members apologizing to the other offended party. Some of the offenders would be subjected to community service, where they clean a road, they dig a public road, they prepare the water facilities for the community, and they would also have reconciliation ceremonies. Different societies had their own ways of how reconciliation ceremonies would be held. But also, whenever somebody had committed several crimes without repenting, then they would call upon the ancestors to punish that individual. Those are ancestral injunctions, and then rituals and so on. And during that time, prisons as a concept did not emerge. So when you see how these systems of administration of justice were existing, and you compare with the contemporary models, you would see there is a balance between traditions and customary law. And there are these four cases that you can read extensively. The Alexa versus Richveld. This is a South African case where it was decided by the Constitutional Court of South Africa, which made the final determination in 2003, and it was based on a Restitution of Land Rights Act of 1994, when apartheid was abolished. And this case involved a community that had occupied the land since time immemorial, but during the colonial era, the state took away the land and considered it as crown land, and the land was transferred to a state-owned mining company, and the community was removed. But when the restitution of land rights came, the community went to court. And there were three issues which they wanted the court to determine. One, they wanted to know whether as a community, they held a legally recognizable right in land under customary law at the time of dispossession. But they also wanted to know whether customary title included rights in minerals and natural resources. And they also put across the question on whether the dispossession racially discriminated within the meaning of the new act which had come into force. And eventually, the Constitutional Court held that this community held indigenous or customary ownership of the land, and that their customary title included the rights to minerals and natural resources, and the state's dispossession was racially discriminatory, and the community was therefore entitled to restoration of the land. So when you read this case, you discover that it affirmed the indigenous or customary title as equivalent to ownership, and these important decisions which I have included. The second case, I will not go into the details much, but it relates to the death of Mr. Biko, who had left his minor daughters and their mother in a house they had shared. But because they were not married, marriage has a legal meaning. You're staying with a woman, even if you have children, does not necessarily mean that you are legally married. You can either be under civil marriage or customary marriage. But in this case, there was a Black Administration Act where they indicated that the eldest son or the closest male relative would inherit the property. And the women and girl children could not inherit any family property. And because of this, there were several other people in this case, and they went to court to determine what happens to estates which are previously governed by customary law if the rule is unconstitutional, and whether this act they were relying on had sections which were unconstitutional, and whether the rule of male inheritance as commonly practiced in most African societies was constitutional. So eventually, court ruled in their favor and found that there were various sections of that act which violated the constitution on equality, on human dignity and children's rights. And this case also set a number of important areas of significance. However, as I conclude, when we are trying to address, to reassert the issue of indigenous knowledge, sometimes there are challenges and opportunities. How to balance the human rights and cultural practices, and how to integrate customary systems with the modern state law, as well as how to strengthen community agency and social harmony remains challenges in some societies, but also there are perceived incompatibility issues with the formal legal systems. And that's why across many African countries, there are several court decisions which have been made trying to interpret the various customs vis-a-vis the modern law and the issues of gender equality, as well as the erosion of our cultures as a result of the urbanization trend. Now, my message as I conclude is that we need to reclaim our roots. And for us to reclaim our roots, we need to document and codify the indigenous institutions of governance and the administration of justice. And we need to integrate the traditional leaders into the national governance architecture. And also as scholars, we need to promote research and education on African governance heritage, because without teaching people, without researching and writing on these, that knowledge will be wasted. So in conclusion, my view is that indigenous systems, they offer very useful governance models that once you delve into these arrangements, you find they have a very important theoretical foundation that we can use to strengthen the teaching of governance and public administration. And they also offer a potential to strengthen justice, especially given the contemporary delays in the administration of justice, but still requires careful integration and adaptation. Briefly, that's what I can present on this topic. Thank you very much.
Professor Basheka, thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. As you were talking, I was thinking of a fellow Ugandan, Mamu Mdamdani, and I wondered if you had thought about his treatment of the notion of customary law and its relationship to what he called, I think, the iron fist or the clasped fist of traditional authority. But maybe that's something we can come to in a moment. I'm very pleased to say that I understand that Professor Augustin Holl has joined us. I know that there were some challenges joining the seminar. Professor Holl, are you with us?
Not at the moment either. I think he's still having some trouble.
He's still having some difficulty. All right. Well, then perhaps we can move on. In that case, I think what I'd like to do is the sort of panelists engage with each other, ask each other some questions, if they have any questions for each other, or any salient points which they'd like to bring out in each other's presentations, and then I'd like to open it up to the floor. Just, I think that the conversation is especially important. Dr. Musa Ali raised this question of, and I think he used an especially lovely expression, the African presence in the world, which I think is now a topic which is now not just of intellectual interest, but of now grave political importance, given what looks to be a resetting of global political relationships, certainly a weakening of the current institutions of global governance. Jeffrey Sachs has been in South Africa recently as part of the various delegations associated with South Africa hosting the G20, which we've done. Looks like we've done with some applaud and a very successful final statement. It looks like. And one of the points that he's made, which Jelena Vidievich has raised in some of the work which she's been writing around and interviews which she's been conducting with leading global policymakers, including the Russians, Karaganov, for example, is the importance of regional and potentially even continental political formations as going forward. Karaganov has got this notion of civilizational states, Russia, China, Africa is not there. Jeffrey Sachs was talking about the absolute importance, it's not negotiable, what he was arguing, of a pan-African political agenda on the African continent, of some form of federation or union of African states to constitute a major political bloc so that Africa has a role in the emerging configuration. And in that context, these sorts of questions of African governance, I think, are especially important, if not existential for all of us on the African continent. Let me get back to the panelists for if there's any engagement they'd like to have with their presentations, and then I'll open up to the floor. Dr. Iye, perhaps you have a sense of what Professor Hall would have said, and perhaps you would speak on his behalf. One dares do something like that. Give you 5 minutes, or starting with you, but perhaps also in relationship to what has been said by your colleagues.
Yes, no, I think what Professor Hall was supposed to present is the detail of the different chapter of the book, and I don't think that it would be necessary here to repeat. I think the book is available online in a PDF or ebook, so people can really go and go to the site of the De Gruyter publisher and get the book. So that's what the Professor Augustin is supposed to present. So but I would like, first of all, to thank very much Professor Mashinka and Professor Opry, and I think the two presentations for me are so linked. Lisa has shown, discussed how the enslaved African deported to the Americas have tried to retain some of the aspect of the African political system of justice and governance, and try to reimagine and recreate it in the diaspora. So that shows also the solidity of all the African paradigms and political paradigms and justice paradigm that survived the dehumanization. They survived all the destruction of African culture elsewhere. And I really also like very much the presentation of Professor Mashinka, because you really have shown in a very simple way all the differences and the genuine aspiration of African governance, what we call indigenous system of governance and justice. And your conclusion, saying your proposal to see how we can revitalize, we can adapt this, is also, I think, an important one. For me, looking what's the experience from different countries, I see definitely this idea of having two parallel systems in our country didn't work. The colonial powers use it by trying to reorganize to their benefit the traditional system of governance, the chiefdom, the kingdom, and all that, and to use them. And after the independence, we continue to make this parallel systems, So some of the countries, what they did is to say, okay, they use the Western concept for the modern state with all these unfitted, paradigms, and they let decide the African chiefdom that they try to manipulate, because also they have money and try to corrupt. But I think we have to finish with this two parallel system. I think we have to integrate the value, the concept about the harmony, about the justice, about the ethics, the fairness that is at the basis of the indigenous African system into the modern system. Because definitely the modern system, we see from despite the proclamation of the human rights, equity and equality, we see how the modern system inherently perpetuate the discrimination, the inequity that we inherited from colonization. So I think we really need much more deeper reflection on how we can identify the concept, the ethics of our indigenous system, and how we can bring them into a modern system, of course, taking into account all what has been lost, because all the traditional system is based on the ethics of the elders. It's based on the social control and the sharing of the ethics by everybody. But today, even I'm sorry to say, even some elders have lost, I think, that legitimacy in a certain way. So how we can correct that when we are using the paradigms and the concept of the indigenous justice and governance system. I think that's where lies that's where are the challenge for us as a scholar, for legislators, all these people making laws, and of course for rulers.
Thank you. Lisa, would you like to say something? Lisa Aubrey, you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you all. This is very exciting, especially for me as someone who gets very frustrated when our scholarly conversations tend to be about the post-colonial, almost always, and hardly ever about the pre-colonial, as if nothing existed, as my colleague from Uganda talked about earlier. I think that this is a very important a revisit to the roots, as our colleague also mentioned. I think part of a big part of our challenge, as Dr. Iye mentioned, I think is the mental and the psychological, even among the elders. Sometimes we can't conceive of what existed without talking about what the colonizers brought to Africa and how the West brought democracy to Africa, which is a farce in many ways. And I think it calls for a lot more critical thinking. And I think Beyond Mimicry gives us a chance to go back to the roots, to reclaim, to resurrect, and to renew, as I mentioned earlier. If anything, I would perhaps look at the subtitle of the book and even the title of the genre in which the book is written. There's a lot of the language, and someone in the comments wrote about language, and language is so important because it points out what we can envision and what we can't envision. It shows some parameters, I think, that keep us sometimes within a colonial or neo-colonial frame that I think we're breaking, and luckily we are breaking out of that. I think what Beyond Mimicry does, it goes beyond reimagining. And the conversation is about reimagining public governance, but we're not really doing the reimagining. I think we are remembering, and that's different. To reimagine suggests that, okay, we're reimagining something that perhaps didn't exist before. But we have the answers that we are looking for if we allow ourselves to remember, not uncritically, but if we remember what existed and what worked for generations, for centuries. And that's what the book does. We have chapters in the book that talk about, like the hair, systems that existed for a very, very long time, that were legitimized by the people, that were validated by the people, that were protected by the people, to which communities complied. They accepted and they complied. But when we talk about this, so the act of memory in this instance is so important. We don't have to reimagine or imagine what Western style liberal democracy can do for Africa. I mean, we have had, decades of that. And we see that that has failed beyond measure. And somehow the West, the global North, can't get rid of its own hubris enough to say that it's not even working in the global North. Look at the mess, the governance mess that is going on in the US now. Where's the rule of law? Where are human rights? Where are collective rights? Where are individual rights? The hallmark of liberal democracy. So liberal democracy itself, which is illiberal, but liberal democracy itself is not even working in the so-called model state, whose structures were exported to Africa and other parts of the world. So we're at a critical juncture here, as Dr. Iye is saying, where liberal democracy itself is imploding. Those are some critical pieces, I think. And I also think one issue that is important to put on the table, that the book does not get to, wasn't intended to get to, but it is a very important call for repair in a judicious way of what was broken by colonialism. So
Lisa,
to talk about repair, to talk about reparations is also an important piece.
Thank you. Just to, Professor Hall has just seems to have managed to join us. So if he's with us, perhaps he could, Professor Hall, are you with us? Seems perhaps he's been struggling with connectivity issues, so I think we've lost him again. So I'm going to open up, but I have to say, Lisa Aubrey, that distinction between reimagining and remembering, I think, is a profound distinction, because this does not seem to be an exercise in nostalgia or a return to an imagined past.
Yes.
But this seems much more to be an exercise on redeeming elements or principles from a past in order to construct something new in the future. And in that sense, it reminds me a little bit of the some of the thinking that went into the movie around Wakanda, Black Panther,
Yes.
Afrofuturism, which I think is a very, very important discourse and a very important framing for some of these conversations around reimagining. Let me open it up to others. So, are there any? We've still got half an hour. So, are there any people? Does anyone want to comment? Otherwise, I'll go to the chats. There's some interesting comments in the chat group. But does anyone have a question that they would like to raise or a comment they would like to make? I think you just raise your hand and Professor Basheka, you are back. I thought we had lost you. So maybe you could, so Kobus van der Merwe, would you turn on your mic and pose a question, please, or make a comment?
Oh. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, the examples that Professor Basheka raised in his presentation are things like land ownership, indigenous law, conflict resolution, and so on. So I'm wondering whether the book has also something to say about, let me call it bureaucracy, the internal administration of these huge departments that we've created under the Western system.
So let's take that as one question. Ahmed has raised another question. Ahmed, would you like to pose your question or make your comment? So the first question is around bureaucracy and administration. Ahmed, you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself? Or Charles, can you unmute Ahmed?
He should be able to unmute. I've allowed his mic.
Ahmed, are you with us? All right. Well, then should we take the first question then, while we wait for Ahmed to join us? So Dr. Ye, perhaps you would like to start with that question around questions of administration and bureaucracy?
Do we have to? I see that Professor Augustin Hall is there. Can we give him the floor, and then we can?
Oh, absolutely. I'd opened up. I hadn't realized he'd returned. So please, Professor Hall, it's a great honor finally to see you and have you joined this event. Do you hear me? We can join you. So please,
we hear you.
Yes. Please, over to you.
Aristoho?
We can hear you.
I mean, it is to me or to Ali?
Well, why don't you answer that first question, but then in relationship to any other broader comments that you'd like to make? Unfortunately, you missed some of the discussion, but obviously you know the book very well, so perhaps you could relate it to some of the broader themes of the book.
Sorry,
Okay.
Igor, can you repeat for me the question?
From what I understand, the question was around whether in various systems of justice in the pre-colonial systems, there were also questions of public administration and bureaucracy. Were there African bureaucracies or public administrations in the pre-colonial period? And I suppose what form did they take if they existed?
I think when it comes to the indigenous system of justice, one of the main achievements of this traditional justice is that they managed to avoid the bureaucracy. Why? Because there is no different level of administrator who are dealing with the issue. You have the parties, involved parties, and they go directly to those elders who are not professional, but people are living their life, cultivator, past nomads. And it is, that's why, for instance, in the case of, in the Somali contest, the traditional justice is much more rapid and not at all bureaucratic. And people, even in the cities, they go to the traditional justice, not necessarily because they like it or they are even aware and know it, because they hear that this system is much more, have no bureaucracy. But when it comes to a certain state, African states and kingdom, yes, and in the case of Ethiopia, the tradition, I mean, the Ethiopian imperial system of justice is known to have been a very bureaucratic one. So we have both. We have, but this system of the imperial system in Ethiopia, and it may exist in other very structured power system in Africa, yes. As soon as there are different people who are really devoted to do that, the abuse of their power, and then they create the machinery of bureaucracy. But in general, when it comes to the indigenous system of justice, I think it's much more fair and quick, because there is no specialized people who can create the bureaucratic obstacles. So that's what I can respond. Of course, now, if this indigenous system is generalized, is institutionalized, that's what and maybe it may create a certain bureaucracy because the file has to be examined in a year. But and I think one of the lessons that we should learn from the indigenous system of justice is to know how they succeed to avoid bureaucracy. I think that is one of the lessons we can draw from that experience.
I would like very much to hear about a system of administration without bureaucracy. Perhaps we can take some of the questions, and Professor Hall, I'll give you a first chance, and maybe you could raise, in dealing with the broader questions, there have been lots of very interesting comments. Some of them are related to specific points which some of the speakers made, so their clarities, the specific question is not always clear. Peter Vale has raised, I think is in relationship to Professor Basheka's presentation. Language is a trap, of course. We can escape the modern traditional binary if we use that old saw traditional leaders. This seems minor but is central to thinking, let alone planning. Yolisa Msweli has said, as Professor Basheka was speaking, he was thinking about gender, women, LGBTQ+, and gender non-conforming individuals, and youth inclusion. I saw gender was mentioned on challenges, but there is a long way to go on other dimensions of gender and making space for the youth in the governance of Africa. And I think there's a history of women leadership on the continent, but limited or insufficiently documented. So those are interesting questions. Perhaps, Professor Hall, there are chapters which deal with some of those questions which you could deal with. Robert replied saying he agreed with the comment, which I've just mentioned. It's very nice to think about customary law as an alternative source of governance, but we also need to realize its shortcomings, exclusion, right of the strongest, and realize it won't appeal to all African audiences. A hybrid form needs to be reimagined, as Lisa rightly says. Andres Dutoy writes, the use of the term endogenous rather than indigenous seems the use of the term endogenous rather than indigenous to avoid essentialist contrasts between a timeless African tradition and a supposedly Western model of governance. Yet statecraft everywhere evolves through encounter, borrowing, and hybridity, not only from China, as Ivor noted, but also from Islamic, Ottoman, and many other traditions. How then do you reconcile endogeneity with this deep historical interdependence? And how do you avoid slipping back into the very Africa-West dichotomy that the book aims to challenge? I think a very, very important question, perhaps, which we can deal with as we come to an end. So I think some very interesting issues are coming up. On the issue of reparations, I find the thinking of progressive Indian academics like Rajiv Malhotra to be quite fascinating. This is a comment by Bhavanesh Prabhu. His idea was that instead of pushing for an unrealistic monetary reparation system, work with willing colonial powers to help them demystify archaic ideas such as good systems of governance, etc., do not exist in pre-colonial times. And then we've just got a general praise for the brilliant presentations. One last point, which someone else might want to take up as well. Rosalie Kingwell writes, I'm concerned about the absence of governance in relation to political economy. Liberal capitalism was not endogenous to the West prior to imperial and industrial revolution, so endogenous in the West would be the feudal system. I sympathize with much of the sentiment, but worry about the lack of grounding in political economy. Capitalism, as we know, takes root within, and once it has taken root, it ceases to be exogenous. I do not notice Africans avoiding private property in markets, though private property in land was not fully taken root. Again, very important contributions. Others so lots of interesting engagements. I think the presentations have provoked much thinking. Professor Hull, because unfortunately you've been prejudiced by technology, may I give you an opportunity to pick and choose from some of those comments and might react to them, but otherwise just make some other general comments which and give you the floor. I don't know if you're able to hear me, Augustin, Professor Hull.
Okay.
Sure.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm really, really sorry about these technological things. So I'm not really sure I know where you are, but I will follow with what I was assigned to do, which is the presentation of a book. And let me share the PPT. Okay. Let me move forward now. Okay. So my assignment was to give a quick presentation of the content of a volume. So in this first slide, you have a cover of a book and its title, which is Beyond Mimicry, the Potential of African and Indigenous Government Systems. So the book is made of two parts, with each part with five chapters or 5 contributions. In the first part, this is capped by the introduction by Dr. Ali Musa and myself. We have 5 contributions that start with chapter 1 by myself, which provide a kind of archaeological exercise on what early human organization could have been, mostly drawing on archaeological record, primatology research, and aspect of social dynamics to formulate hypotheses on early human social organizations. There are also some later archaeological cases from West Africa that features the diversity of early form of political organizations. In chapter 2, I tried to look at material signature of human relationship. All the material culture is generally a sign of relationship between individuals. And so these elements of material culture all point to social connections. In chapter 3, Professor Yoporika Somet analyzes pharaonic cosmogony, explaining the concept of math, its cosmic, social, and eschatological significance, and he discusses how this cosmogony defined the characteristic of a pharaonic state, considered by some contemporary Egyptologists as the first known state governed by the rule of law. In chapter 4, Professor Fode Musa Sidibe looked at the Mande Charter of Mali Empire, which is the constitution of that big West African empire following the defeat of his opponent, which is Sumaworo Kante. He looked at it from the lens of a particular oral source, the initiatic oral narrative of West African Brotherhood of Donso Hunters. He discusses the narrative of West African Brotherhood of Donso Hunters and the metaphysical, spiritual, philosophical foundation of a system of governance introduced by the traditional hunters through the interpretation of initiatic words, expressions, and the rituals that were used in the process leading to the proclamation of the Mandate Charter in the 13th century CE. In chapter 5, Dr. Ali Musa presents a specific endogenous system of governance that emerged among pastoralist society in the Horn of Africa in the 16th century. And that endogenous system is known as the Issa Khair. And in chapter 6, Dr. Zelalem Tesfaye Sidma presents the Oromo Gada system as an indigenous egalitarian social, political, and religious system developed by the Oromo people living in Ethiopia and Kenya. That's the end of part 1. In part 2, also with 5 chapters, we have experience on revitalization of African indigenous systems and practices of governance undertaken in Africa and in the African diaspora at different periods of history. In chapter 7, Professor David Sebudubu provides a critical account of Botswana indigenous governance system, which has been sustained to complement its modern government system since the independence. He analyzes the strategy, processes, and procedures that Botswana modern state has put in place to institutionalize the integration of indigenous system. In chapter 8, Professor Dumiso Dlala analyzes the use, abuse, and instrumentalization of the philosophy of Ubuntu in the context of South Africa's transition from colonial domination to democracy. He discusses the exigencies of Ubuntu against the prevailing order and explores the implications of this philo-praxis for a new constitutional order in South Africa, which could frame a human order based on the recognition of the humanness of all human beings. Dr. Larissa Egabara in chapter 9 analyzes how Maroon entity created by Africans in Brazil reappropriated and revalorized African government system in hostile situations to resist Portuguese enslavement system. She described the characteristic of a Maroon resistance such as Palmares and the Kingdom of Congo as authentic socio-political organizations. In chapter 10, Mrs. Martina Amoxi analyzes how many of the enslaved people from West Africa who were deported on a large scale to Suriname in the 17th century to work on sugar plantation choose freedom, fled in the immense forest inside the country, and used the African ancestral knowledge about nature and human organization to survive and create thriving societies. In the conclusion, finally, the editors of the book recall the necessity to develop solid and coherent philosophical, ethical, and spiritual framework rooted in the cultural specificities of concerned people in any revitalization of indigenous governance system. They highlight the urgency to transform and renovate the whole system of education inherited from colonization and develop new content and method of learning and teaching to transmit indigenous knowledge and experience from early age. And finally, to that end, the editors suggest to launch national debate in interested African countries to develop critical thinking about revitalization of indigenous knowledge system and the renovation of governance in Africa. And our webinars is part of this effort to bring that discussion and that debate to the fore. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that overview of the book, Professor Ol. Just before you joined us, I think a very interesting conversation was beginning to emerge between some of the audience and the presentations. And I think I think in the minutes we have left, I would ask you to respond. I think there is a concern by some of the listeners, and it's been very interesting that we've had a stable audience throughout. So I think there's enormous interest in the topic and a fascination with the topic. How does one not? Is there not a danger that this is an exercise in nostalgia or romanticism of the past, trying to reconstruct practices from the past and reproduce them in the present, even though the circumstances are so different? And African societies now face very, very different kinds of challenges, especially that of war and the threat or the risk of reconquest or being at least marginalized in a changing world order. So how do these sorts of questions around reimagining and moving beyond mimicry begin to deal with some of the real contemporary challenges and not become an exercise in nostalgia or romanticism?
Oh, the question is addressed to me because I have really problem listening. Okay. Anyway, I have problem with my computer, but I think that the revitalization of, if I understood the question well, the revitalization of indigenous system is contingent on its preservation in different parts of Africans and Afro-descendant countries. But most in most African countries, it has been erased by the efforts of colonialists that have demonized many practices, many African practices. Some of them are gone, and the diaspora is probably the conservatory of some of these practices that have disappeared from the African continent. But through research, through historical research, even archaeological research, it is possible to recreate, not to bring back what existed in the past, but to recreate based on the contemporary experience of the failure of imported system, relying on the philosophy of our ancestor or what we know of this philosophy today. It is possible to, as we use the Italian term, aggiornamento, to create something new that is inspired by African experience, but that does not reject everything that came out of the European encounter. So it is a creative work because we cannot go back centuries ago. We have to create from our cultural experience something that fits in the sovereignist experience Africa is moving through today. And so it is something for all the intellectuals, the artists, and the politicians to try to revive local practices and see how they fit in the contemporary state model we have inherited from colonization. It is an exacting, it is difficult, it is not easy, but that's something that has to be done because we have tried with representative elective democracy in different places. But if we look at the historical experience, no country really developed based on multi-party fighting every 5 years. It is the result of a long-term process when all the dragon of Southeast Asia was a dictatorship in the 60s. And that's how they built the industrial bases. In the 18 or 1970s, there was what was called enlightened despotism, which means you limit infighting in political terms to major goals. You don't need to copy the Chinese model, but a model that keep political bickering at minimum is probably what we may need in Africa in order to try to move forward. Because we see in Cameroon today, we see in Guinea-Bissau and everywhere, the representative democracy poses more problem than solution in Africa today.
A hugely important conversation. I know that Lisa Aubrey would like to come in here. One experience which I find fascinating, and that is, which I think is an important reference point in this conversation, perhaps, is the Japanese experience after the 1880, after the Meiji Restoration, of sending delegations of Japanese scholars and practitioners to learn from the West, but to bring them back to Japan and essentially to indigenize them. And of course, the shogun class moves from being a military class to essentially becoming a Japanese public administration, the bureaucratic class. So I think these sorts of the questions which are being posed in this seminar and potentially and in this book, I think are the questions of the day. Lisa, I'll give you the last word because I can see that we're almost at 6. Please.
Okay. I was actually going to raise the Japan experience as you did, because what we say is that Japan looked inside, right? And they brought out those things that would give them a chance to emerge on the world stage. So they went inside. I don't think it was an issue of nostalgia as much as taking those, the best practices, taking those assets and building on those things. And I think that is what Hall was telling us. I think that is what the book tells us. And I wonder to myself if we are extra hard on Africa, extra demanding on Africa, because when Europe talks about John Stuart Mills, Hobbes, Locke, and they talk about Rousseau, and they talk about Adam Smith, is that an exercise in nostalgia? As opposed to going back to thinkers, to practices, like Africa going back to the Mandam Charter and saying that we have something here that we can build on. So let's not ask of Africa what we are not asking of other parts of the world. And I think Beyond Mimicry gives us a chance to say these are systems, these are endogenous systems that work. They had answers that we can again revisit, we can renew, we can resurrect, of course, in the context of modern times. Of course, in the context and to the question about political economy. Of course, we're not talking about going back and staying stuck in the past. Absolutely not. We're saying that the roots have something, not only that it has offered Africa, but it's offered the world. We're saying, let's go back to that and build on that. And let's not ask of Africa what we have not asked of other parts of the world.
Thank you. We've got a few minutes left. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Ali Musaiya for a final word. And it's been a riveting experience for me. I think these conversations are certainly unfortunately rare, and I look forward to an opportunity to have more of these sorts of conversations, potentially in person, and to think more concretely around the questions that the seminar has posed. So it's been a great pleasure to host you all, and I will hand over to Dr. Ali Musaiev for final remarks. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Ivor. Well, my final remarks will be about the question that you raised, the nostalgia. Well, in any work of recreation, of reinvention, and revitalization, we have two obstacles to be aware of. One is nostalgia, second is essentialism, and third is how I can say kind of naivety. Yeah, I think when the first generation of Africans who talk about the African indigenous system of governance system were maybe a little bit nostalgic, maybe a little bit essentialist, and maybe a little bit naive to think that thing would be easier to. So but today we have, we have 3 decades of experience, and I think today we are equipped, I think, to really analyze and address this issue. Okay, because we know that the Africans for whom this indigenous system was created are not the same. That's for sure. And I already talked about the rulers, the chiefdom. They are also, today suffering of kind of corruption, competition. The disease of the political modern political has also, I think, attained our traditional system. So we should be very aware. So what kind of system that's drawing lessons from our indigenous system we can build today for the Africans of today? So that's, I think, the challenge. And the challenge is less to do the same thing or and adapted things than to pull the concept, the paradigm, the philosophy, the essence of that we will reintroduce in our modern institutions. So the notion of harmony before the fairness. And I think Dr. Besheke have really make a very beautiful comparison table showing that the different paradigm that we can really appropriate and try how to integrate this into a new system of governance, modern system of governance. So I think it's not an easy task, that's for sure. It needs a very, very critical thinking. But I think it is something that we have to do because we have no other choice, in fact. Because, 20 years ago, we thought that maybe the liberal democracy can work. If we try, it could not work. We know that it is already failing in the country that it was born. So why it could work in Africa? So if we have no other choice, I think that is maybe the new context that help us to go ahead in this. So that means collecting, analyzing this different system and creating a debate. So that's why we are in the book, we are proposing that there is in each African country, we have a national debates about that, exchanging and comparing experience. Like the Botswana experience is very interesting. There is some good things going on there, but there is also some problems that the colleague who wrote the article is really highlighting. The article in South Africa about Ubuntu is a very, very beautiful one because it criticizes how the Ubuntu philosophy has been abused to not going further in the change and transformation in South Africa, So yes, we are aware of the task, we are aware of the difficulty, and I think it is the time to begin this at all levels, at the university level, and I see here someone is proposing to submit, to propose these books to students. So we have to engage this collective effort at different level, And I'm sure we will end it up with some workable proposal for the renewal of our political system, because we have no other choice than going ahead in that. So that is what I would like to say, and within a perspective, that's what we are doing. And we are realizing that there's a more and more interest everywhere, and not only in Africa, even in the West. A lot of people are questioning the so-called liberal democracy and how it has been used in their own country. And today they are realizing that all the big lies that has been taught through the about this. So I think, and in Latin America, a very interesting also reflection is going on in Asia as well. So I think the global South, and that's maybe what I am. I think the global South, if all these efforts and work could be are put together, the global South can make proposal to save the humanity and the world. Yeah. And we hope that the BRICS can also integrate this aspect of the paradigm change that we need, this aspect into their programs, which is now mostly focused on economy and financial and all that. So it's a collective work, and we hope that we can end it up with some concrete result. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. Before we leave, just to say we're looking forward to other events of this nature. What I can say is that I'm very pleased to see that he's been part of the conversation. Andrew Dutoy and Andrew Chapman have produced a fascinating paper for us, which will speak to some of these broader questions. What they're finding is that in South Africa, substantial portions of the middle class are preferring to leave formal cities or formal regulated areas and move into areas which are under chiefly authority, and in a phenomenon which they're calling exurbanization on a fairly grand scale. We're looking forward to the presentation of that paper. And I'm hoping that there will be further engagements in the spirit of the conversation of today. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. It's been, I think, a fascinating afternoon, and I look forward to meeting all of you in person at some stage in the near future. So thank you very much.